As the visitor draws the foot-long claw from his pocket, the scientist's heart begins to race. Rummaging through her mental catalog of anatomy, Dr. Angela Milner recognizes it in a flash. This claw belonged to a huge, flesh-eating dinosaur. But that's all she knows, because nothing quite like it has ever been seen. It's not that dinosaurs don't occur in Britain. They were a British invention, after all. The first dinosaurs to introduce themselves to science were collected from the English countryside. With luck, some fell into the laps of perceptive British anatomists. These were eccentric, mutton-chop-wearing men, consumed by the mysteries of Earth history. In an early effort to make sense of the strange creatures, one of these chaps coined the very word, dinosaur. But even after 140 years worth of discoveries, no animal fit for a claw such as this had surfaced. This is new. Is there more of it? As Milner presses the visitor for details, he explains that it was not he but his father-in-law that made the discovery. She insists that she meet him, and that she see from exactly where the claw came. She and Alan Charig drive from London's Natural History Museum to suburban Surrey to seek out the 59-year-old William Walker, a plumber by trade, fossilist at heart. Possessed by fossils, and owner of a proud set of mutton chops himself, Walker stands like a time-traveling member of that extinct breed of Victorian naturalists. Thrilled, Walker leads them to a brick mining pit. Apparently, he had just been walking around when he chanced upon a stone that bore a streak of brown bone. After delivering a good crack from his hammer, he stood in shock at the foot-long claw that spilled out before him. But now, a month later, he can't seem to relocate exactly where that happened. Bulldozers have beaten them to the site and have chewed through the terrain. They assume the worst. Just then, the plumber's eye catches some bone chips in the mud. Beneath are larger chunks of churned up, bulldozed bone. The claw was not an isolated piece. There's more of the monster buried. A lot more. Charig and Milner returned that May, armed with the full cooperation of the brick company and an excited crew. But when they shovel the mud out of the way, they're not met with a pristine skeleton sprawled out in a forgiving sediment. Instead, they find a patch of lumpy stones, concretions like the one that cradled the claw. Confident that the surviving bones are in the blocks, they salvage each one, all 2 tons worth. The excavation takes 17 days in all, but the detailed work of freeing individual bones in the lab would consume 6 years. Word of the mystery dinosaur, a find that Alan Charig would later call the most important fossil find in Europe or Britain this century, spreads around the world. It's not every day that new kinds of giant, flesh-eating dinosaurs are scooped up from a London suburb. As images of the claw circulate, some experts are reminded of the infamous sickle claw for which Velociraptor and its relatives are famous. This evokes thoughts of a supersized British raptor, but the story this fossil has to tell is much more interesting. As piece after precious piece appears, the skeleton quickly becomes the most intact carnivorous dinosaur ever found in Britain. And because all charismatic fossils yearn for a good nickname, Charig and Milner call theirs claws. Just as the greatest prize of any game animal is, of course, the head, so it is with the extinct, and Claws is happy to oblige. By the 1980s, finds from around the world were showing that flesh-eating dinosaurs were spectacularly diverse. While their skulls differed in the details, large predatory dinosaurs all had deep, rounded-off muzzles. But the face smiling back from the rock in London's Natural History Museum does not adhere to any such pattern. It is an alien. By 1986, 3 years after Walker's discovery, about 70% of the fossils have been exposed. In the pages of the prestigious journal Nature, Charig and Milner introduce Baryonyx walkeri to the world. Baryonyx derives from the Greek barus, meaning heavy, and onyx for claw. The second name honors the keen-eyed William Walker. For him, it's the thrill of a lifetime to have a dinosaur named after him. When someone finds a new organism, it's not enough to just slap a name on it and call it a day. That's a start, but it's a crime against biology to orphan new additions to the tree of life. So the biologists must find a home for their new organism, a distinct twig. Ever since Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace showed that all species descend from the same distant ancestor and are therefore knitted together into a great tree of life, it's been one of biology's primary goals to reveal the shape of this network. On which twig does the new species belong? Hard to say, because the tree has so many limbs and is lush beyond words and tall as could be. Fortunately, DNA can do much of the heavy lifting for living creatures, spilling volumes about who is related to whom. But the dinosaurs have left behind nothing to work with but their hard, skeletal anatomy, and so begins the long and tedious process of comparison. While baryonyx is strange, it's got a lot more in common with beasts like Allosaurus and Tyrannosaurus than with anything else. And there's a home for carnivorous dinosaurs, and it's called the theropoda. It's a thick limb from which about a third of all dinosaur species dangle. Smaller offshoots anchor clusters of closely related species. These are called families. The family Tyrannosauridae, for instance, was invented to account for T-Rex and its closest relatives. Here you'll find a set of unnerving brutes, animals bearing small, two-pronged arms and monstrous, bone-crushing jaws. They share these traits for precisely the same reason that siblings resemble their parents, because these species come from the same genetic stock, a parent species or common ancestor. Tyrannosauridae is but one family in the theropoda, and when Charig and Milner try to find a place for baryonyx, they run into trouble. There are no families it can be placed into without sticking out like a sore thumb claw. So they do what a good taxonomist is supposed to under the circumstances. They create a new family to house it and its close relatives, should they appear. For the time being, though, baryonyx stands alone as the sole member of the Baryonychidae. What's so special about this creature? What warrants the invention of an entirely new family? Well, as mentioned, the skull is freakish, so aberrant that some questioned if it was even a dinosaur at all. The bones of the snout interlock to form a wavy tooth row, culminating in a hooked tip. The arched jaw slots neatly into the kink above, forging a sturdy clasp on writhing prey. Charig and Milner call this peculiar arrangement of teeth and jaws a terminal rosette. The most massive teeth are stationed in this rosette, making for one ruthless meat trap. Speaking of teeth, baryonyx has a lot of them, more than any other theropod. While those in the lower jaws had broken free, each side has 32 sockets, twice as many as the famous Allosaurus. While Allosaurus had thin, recurved teeth, serrated front and back, baryonyx has a mouthful of pegs. These are thick, more straightened, and anchored by incredibly deep roots. The crowns are traversed by serrations fine to the point of being microscopic. Even their texture is zany. A tapestry of strange wrinkles etches this toothscape, while ridges run up and down their length like the fluting on a Hellenic column. The long, bony nostril is pulled far from the front of the skull, yet another curious deviation from more vanilla theropods. A thin comb of bone ascends from this beast's forehead, completing its devilish character. A few of their peers accused Charig and Milner of having this thing all wrong. This was not the face of a dinosaur, they say, but a Cretaceous crocodile that was buried and preserved alongside one. But Charig and Milner know what they have. Despite the likeness, this is no crocodile. The rest of the animal is anomalous too. The neck bones fail to string together into the standard theropod S-curve. Instead, it has more of a crescent-shaped neck posture. The upper arm bone, while somewhat flattened on the ends, is hugely broad, surely a sign of a well-muscled arm. And that massive claw isn't just big for other dinosaurs, it's big for baryonyx, too. At first, it was tempting to assume that such a giant claw was only fit for a theropod of mythical heft, but while this claw is bigger than that of the 8.5-meter Allosaurus, baryonyx on the whole is less massive. This talon is a proportional monstrosity. If you've never heard of baryonyx, Take a moment to reflect on these characteristics. Recall the placement of the nose, the meat-trap jaws, the numerous gripping teeth. Consider its robust arms and colossal claw. Ask yourself, what sort of prey was Baryonyx after? We'll return to this later. It's worth noting that this perplexing snout isn't totally unique among theropods. In fact, it reminds Charig and Milner of another critter that would later become famous for its poison-spitting cameo in Jurassic Park. At more than 20 feet long, Dilophosaurus was among the first truly large theropods. Known from Arizona's 190-million-year-old early Jurassic rocks, it preceded Baryonyx by about 70 million years, living at a time when the supercontinent Pangaea first began shearing itself apart in earnest. That kink in the snout is hard to ignore, as is the fact that both bore bony accoutrements on their heads. Could Baryonyx have been a late surviving relative of Dilophosaurus? Charig and Milner say no. They prefer convergent evolution as an explanation, leaving the origins of Baryonyx murky as ever. But dissenting views about the animal's identity and the existence of the Baryonychid family are raised almost as soon as Baryonyx is set loose. Artist Greg Paul, to whom we can credit much of how our image of dinosaurs has been shaped, is among the critics. Baryonyx appears on his radar just as he's preparing to publish his now classic volume on predatory dinosaurs. It's so strange that he postpones the book. Famous for his skeletal reconstructions, Paul produces a rendering of a full Baryonyx skeleton running at a full sprint. The drawing is a preliminary one, he warns, that will need replacing when the full description comes out. Despite having never seen the specimen in person, he protests to some of Charig and Milner's conclusions. He finds the similarities between their animal and Dilophosaurus more convincing. Paul believes that the two shared a loose ancestor-descendant relationship. He goes as far as to model the British creature's missing parts, including its absent tail, after that of Dilophosaurus. Now, time has not treated this hypothesis kindly, as today they are no longer believed to be close relatives. But Dilophosaurus aside, Paul thinks that Baryonyx is not the only creature of its kind. He and a leading French paleontologist independently arrive at the same conclusion, that Baryonyx is not alone in the theropod empire. Another species, survived only by a few drawings published in an obscure German journal at the height of the First World War, may hold the key to making sense of this croc-snouted dinosaur. This forgotten creature was the greatest contribution of an adventurous gentleman scientist, a man who lived to see his life and career crumble around him. It was the most cryptic dinosaur fossil ever found. Its dimensions were unparalleled. Its back was adorned with humongous spines, but no living paleontologist had set their eyes on it. The bones do not reside in any museum. The one and only specimen was destroyed long ago amid the chaos of the Second World War. And like much that is wild in this world, it came from Africa.
Got him, boy, right in the middle. Black coming up. Okay, don't shout all at once.
The day had come. The old scientist's nightmare was now a reality.
Hello, Skipper. Hello, Navigator. Half a minute to go. Okay. Hello, Engineer. Skipper here. Yeah? Will you put the revs up, please? Yeah?
On a spring night in 1944, a sortie of 244 Lancaster bombers, Britain's shining sword, set their sights on his city, Munich. Among their targets is the city's central railway station.
A lot of searchlights and fighter flares, Skipper. Yeah, leave on. Okay, boys, okay. Hello, Bombardier. Okay when you are. Bomb doors open. Bomb doors open, Bombardier. Bomb's going in a minute.
By sunrise, the railway and its surrounding switchyards are reduced to a smoldering patchwork of flames and twisted metal. But such aerial bombardments aren't defined by their accuracy and are as much feared for their strategic effectiveness as for the randomness of the devastation. 7,000 buildings surrounding the railway burn. The paleontologist, now at the end of his long career, receives word of the attack from his family castle in Nuremberg, and though it's unclear how or when he learned this, he would eventually discover that sometime after midnight, a stray bomb landed directly on his museum, gutting its innards and pulverizing its contents, including his life's work, all of his dinosaurs. But they were the least of his losses.
It's definitely going down now. Good, Jimmy, I can see it, boy. Good show.
It's January 1911, and Ernst Freier Stromer von Reichenbach, or Ernst Stromer as we'll call him, is 64 days into his expedition, well on his way to becoming a desert creature. This small man is obsessed with a huge problem. Was it Africa, he asks, rather than Europe or Asia, as his colleagues hold, that the earliest mammals blossomed into being? This image depicts a more hardened and dissatisfied version of the 40-year-old that first set foot on the docks of Alexandria. And now, after months of failure, his situation is dire. This locale holds his last hope of finding something amazing. But just as he and his Egyptian companions settle into camp, black clouds swallow the desert. A sandstorm follows close behind. Between bickering with the crew in his broken Arabic and shivering in the cold, Stromer's only refuge is his flea-infested sleeping bag. Over the next few days, when he's not fighting to keep the winds from tearing his tent out of the earth and into the sky, all he can do is reflect on the past 2 months, the most difficult and eventful months of his life. When the ports of Alexandria first came into view from the deck of the steamship he boarded in Italy, Stromer had grand plans for the coming journey. The names of the people he was to meet, the times his train would leave its station, exact dates and grand expectations flooded his orderly mind. But troubles began before he set foot in the country. He spent the nights lying awake, stricken with seasickness, and the days absorbing verbal abuse from a colleague that snuck his crabby wife along. Despite being born to a wealthy family, Stromer's own pockets never seemed to run very deep, and this trip was to depend on a paltry, shoestring budget. Just as he thought he was going to feel the relief of dry land beneath his trembling feet, the ship went into lockdown. Convinced that a sick passenger had cholera, the captain quarantined the vessel. A day and a half passed before they set foot on Egyptian soil. The trio took a train south to the crowded, chaotic, and bustling capital, Cairo. There, Stromer did his best to show the couple the sights and sounds of the ancient city, introducing them to the great European scientists and explorers of the age. But the snobbish pair were unimpressed. If Cairo could be called dull, Stromer politely warned, then the Sahara that awaited them was a hell on earth. They abandoned Stromer, and half of his supplies left with them. From there, he frantically crisscrossed Cairo, collecting permits and meeting colleagues. But his checklist couldn't be complete without his desert companion. Richard Markgraf's fluency both in Arabic and in the ways of the Sahara made him indispensable. But Stromer couldn't seem to find him. On the verge of giving up, the scientist was relieved when he inserted the key into the door of his hotel room, only to find Richard Markgraf sitting inside, waiting. A portrait of the man survives, which betrays a face for which the sun held no mercy. His caring eyes burrowed deeply in their sockets, his cheeks and forehead furrowed far beyond his ears, his cracked lips buried in the wiry beard of a wild man. What little is known of Markgraf, a man of Czech descent that spent his impoverished adult life in Egypt, is that he possessed an incredible capacity for hard work, as well as an unmatched ability to find and collect important fossils. The German knew this better than anyone, as Markgraf was responsible for finding some of those toothy, prehistoric whales that served as a foundation of the studies that built his reputation. The journey was to be comprised of 3 phases. First, they were to search for early mammal fossils in a valley west of Cairo, but after working tirelessly for weeks, they had little to show for it. Stromer left early to plan for the next phase, leaving Markgraf behind to carry on. When they met again a week later, Markgraf placed in his boss's hands the skull of a small monkey. Stromer named the species Libipithecus markgrafi after his friend. Then they turned their attention south near the ancient ruins at Luxor, where the 2 men, a few camels, and an Egyptian cook explored a steaming sea of outcrop east of the Nile. This time, it was Markgraf that left early. Working in isolation day after day, Stromer was rewarded in divine panoramic views and hazy red sunsets, but not in fossils. Humbled, he caught a train back to Cairo. There, he opened a disastrous letter. Markgraf, one to suffer from bouts of violent sickness, would be unable to weather the 3rd and final phase. And monkeys aside, the expedition had so far, in the way of fossils at least, been a failure. And now, Stromer was without his most vital ally. Desperate to fill his place, Stromer hired an entirely Egyptian team of cooks, guides, and camel drivers. The X on his map was a poorly known section of the western desert, some 370 kilometers west of Cairo, called the Bahariya. The miniature caravan set out for their long Saharan slog. In the evenings, when the winter chill proved intolerable, Stromer dismounted and walked beside the camels to conjure heat from his chattering body. After a week of marching, they arrive and become bogged down first by rain and then by a surge of stinging sand. But now, after days of turmoil, the desert grows silent. Scrambling around the sandstone slopes, Stromer keeps his eyes wide for fossils. The next few days are exhausting. He finds fossils of sharks, fish, crocodiles, and some bits and bobs of reptilian seagoing plesiosaurs. Nothing extraordinary, but something. These convince him that the Bahariya is Cretaceous in age, something previous geologists had speculated. Though precise ages were unknowable to him, where the numbers stand today, the Bahariya and its fossils seem to be between 95 and 100 million years old. All this time, something has been calling to him. Like an all-seeing eye, a 500-foot hill towers over this Martian landscape. Entranced, he leads the party in its direction. Surrounding this wind-carved cathedral of stone are weathered bone chips, pieces of crocs and sharks scattered about. But as the German scans the hill in the tower's shadow, his heart sinks, and no matter how vigorously he rubs his eyes with his mouth ajar in silent disbelief, these mirages refuse to vanish. The gigantic bones sprawled out before him are very real. At his feet are, quote, 3 large bones which I attempt to excavate and photograph. His search image, attuned to picking out the tiny, shrewish remains of mammals, is now swamped by objects thousands of times more massive. No expert in fossil reptiles, he can still recognize that huge bones of land-living creatures found in Cretaceous rocks can mean only one thing. Apparently, he writes, these are the first of Egypt's dinosaurs. Parts of a pelvis, spinal column, and even a hooked claw are among the day's thrills. But giant bones pose giant problems, and Stromer is at a loss to properly retrieve and transport them. He collects what he can before retiring to his tent, where he scribbles into his journal while the chattering of jackals fill the desert. Then he does the unthinkable. He abandons the site, his only promising lead in 2 months of prospecting. As they soldier forth, they pass chunks of jagged dinosaurs, huge limb bones poking through the desert floor like compound fractures in the Earth's crust. They vacuum up bits of fish and marine reptiles in their path, but supplies are thinning. By its end, This journey was surely the most exhausting thing he had ever done. As he starts back to the city, he's beaming, at least on the inside. He's tapped into a new world of dinosaurs, fish, and reptiles, a lost paradise. But Egypt is harsh, and he's not built for the work. Even before leaving for the Bahariya, he wrote, "I am too frail for such expeditions. I substitute tenacity and flexibility for the strength and pluck that I lack." Never again does Stromer see the land of the pharaohs. But Margraf, living in the western desert and always hungry for work, was born for the job. From 1912 to 1914, he works alone in the Bahariya. A steady stream of new discoveries, which we'll meet later, are brought to light through the partnership, Margraf the field man and Stromer the scientist. But tensions between Germany and Britain are rising. British officials in Egypt, which was then a protectorate of the crown, now claim all shipments bound for Germany as their own. Margraf panics, as Stromer can't pay him until he has the fossils. But as of July 28, 1914, when the Great War begins, it seems that nothing could free their treasures. But in 1916, British authorities have a change of heart. Margraf fell ill, as he often did over the course of his short life, and died, leaving his wife penniless. Per Stromer's pleadings, British authorities gift her a lump sum and offer to house the fossils, all 12 cases of them. Though Stromer would not see the specimens for another 8 years, or his friend ever again, Markgraf's work was to provide him with decades worth of fertile research. Four years earlier, in 1912, while Markgraf's brow dripped with sweat in the Egyptian sun, Stromer's was wrinkled in concentration. The latest shipment contained a set of alien remains. In Stromer's care were a dozen vertebrae, some ribs, a set of prodigious lower jaws, and more than a dozen conical teeth. The specimen was incomplete, and through Markgraf, Stromer understood that it was in a sorry state to begin with. As he writes, many of the bones had already been broken and deformed in the sediment. Furthermore, the remains were completely jumbled. The skull seems to have originally been present, but due to its exposed position had been almost completely eroded away. Two things must have been striking about the skeleton. First, each back vertebra rooted a tower of bone, the longest of which stood a full 6 feet high. These spines stitched into a spectacular fin atop the animal's back. The function of this sail, as it's called, is a mystery to Stromer, and it's been a mystery ever since. Countless hypotheses, some plausible, others less so, have been advanced to explain it in the last 100 years. We'll address this mystery in another episode, where we'll discover what this monstrosity was like as a living, breathing animal. Just as impressive is the animal's overall size. His measurements are almost hard to believe. Some context. By 1900, the previous century's influx of sauropod dinosaurs, that collection of long-necked, long-tailed, earth-shaking species from the much older Jurassic rocks of the American West, some of which pushed more than 20 tons in weight, had cemented the idea of reptilian behemoths in the minds of scientists and the world. And where there is flesh, there are flesh seekers. It was logical, therefore, to predict that the largest animals to walk the earth were fed upon by predators of appropriate stature. And they were. Allosaurus, then the largest terrestrial carnivore known to have lived, weighed as much as 3 huge brown bears. But deposits from the younger Cretaceous period had an unholy surprise in store. Expeditions into Montana and Wyoming at the beginning of the 20th century produced the remains of a carnivore that had to be seen to be believed. In the course of our evolution, human beings have feared, fled, and grappled with predators, the bears, crocs, and cats with which we have shared landscape. There exists a reservoir of deep genetic memory that perpetuates our awareness of and fear for large carnivores. So the existence of a butcher, as sizable and powerful as this one, as vulgar a shock to its discoverers as it was to polite society, was as unforeseeable as the atomic bomb. It was a monster that seemed more likely to be feasting on souls in Bosch's depiction of hell than stalking prey in the jungles of history. It would take 9 of some of the largest bears alive, or 3.5 Allosaurus, to match the conservative mass estimates for this ultra predator. At the turn of the 20th century, the fact that colossal but peaceful leaf eaters were inhabiting the distant past was safely understood. But ever since being reintroduced to the wild as Tyrannosaurus rex in 1905, this killer has stalked the jungles of the human mind. 7 years after that name was first uttered, Stromer opens a shipping crate containing the colossal but fractured and incomplete skeleton of a sail-backed theropod from Egypt, thereby bearing witness to the world's second such ultra-predator. But aside from providing measurements of individual bones and simply referring to the animal as large, Stromer, a man of understatements, declines to reiterate or emphasize this fact in his study. I imagine him taking quiet, personal delight in finding that his animal may well have exceeded even the 40-foot T-Rex in total length. He concludes his 1915 description by gifting a name to the beast. He writes that, quote, "The establishment of a new genus and species is certainly justified, which I name according to its most conspicuous character, the spinous process of the trunk vertebrae, and after the land of origin, Spinosaurus aegypticus." Some have accused him of showing a lack of creativity for this name, but I think it's only when you're sharing a lexicon with a name like Tyrannosaurus rex, the tyrannical king of reptiles, that Spinosaurus aegypticus could sound benign by comparison. The man responsible for naming Tyrannosaurus was Henry Fairfield Osborn, paleontologist at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. As remains of the tyrant king were being extracted from the rock, drawings of a fully assembled rex towering over a human were produced under his direction. Before anyone had ever seen a mounted T-Rex in person, these put the size of this ultra-predator in perspective for the first time, and almost 20 years after naming it, Stromer creates just such a drawing for his Spinosaurus in Osbornian tradition. In 1936, the world got its first taste of a restored Spinosaurus skeleton, the second flavor of ultra-predator. Stromer was liberal enough to infer the shapes of missing bones from other theropods, but despite the slender jaws, he was too conservative to give it anything other than a blocky, Allosaurus-like skull. In his survey of theropod dinosaurs, the legendary Friedrich von Huene said what Stromer was too polite to say himself. Upon comparing Osborn's measurements to those of Stromer's dinosaur, Huene declared that Spinosaurus may have been the largest beast of prey there ever was. Another thing that stood out to Stromer, and what's worth remembering for our purposes, is that the teeth were distinct from all other theropods. They're straight, cone-shaped to the extreme, and while other theropods have serrations, tiny ridges like those on a steak knife, Spinosaurus teeth lacked those altogether. People often compare T-Rex teeth to railroad spikes because of their thick, cross-sectional roundness, but that's a comparison for which Spinosaurus is far more worthy, as its deeply rooted teeth could hardly be said to curve at all. Evolution had honed these teeth to seize and grip prey, not to shear or dice it. Under the circumstances, Stromer does an exceptional job. Given such alien spines, slender jaws, and straightened, unserrated teeth, traits totally unique among theropods, it's a testament to his skill as an anatomist that he manages to recognize it as a dinosaur at all. Unlike Baryonyx, though, Spinosaurus fails to steal the eyes of the world. When the first mounted skeleton of Tyrannosaurus rex went up in New York in 1915, it set the headlines ablaze. When Stromer named Spinosaurus that year, it did nothing of the sort, because it was 1915, and Europe was mad. And for the millions then fighting for their lives in the inferno along Europe's front lines, in the putrid trenches of France, high in Italy's shivering Alps or in the fly-choked Dardanelles, their world really was on fire. Word of a curious set of bones from Egypt was lost in the shock of ceaseless shelling and rifle fire. After the war, most of Margraaf's fossils were still in the belly of the Geological Survey of Egypt. Though the authorities had held on to the crates, they proved unwilling to relinquish them. But pressure from Stromer's peers proved annoying enough for British authorities to finally grant their release. But Stromer, financially crippled by Germany's inflation crisis, couldn't afford to pay for the deliverance of the specimens. It was then that an old student of his, now an established zoologist, stepped forward to personally pay the huge shipping cost. In 1922, 8 years after having been collected, the fossils arrive at his door. But authorities back in Egypt hadn't been kind to the parcels. The bones had been toyed with and haphazardly repackaged, leaving them in crumbled disrepair. But Stromer and Margraaf had worked too hard, had invested too much money, too much life force for him to give up now. The scientist patiently dedicated the next few years to reassembling the fossils, to working through impossible puzzles of bone chips. And the results were astonishing. Spinosaurus did not live in a vacuum, but a hugely rich ecosystem teeming with life. In the 1920s and 30s, Stromer is describing new species left and right. Among his dinosaurs are vertebrae and limbs from a new species of long-necked sauropod that he calls Egyptosaurus bahariensis in 1932. Amazingly, Stromer didn't have just one ultra-predator, but 3. In 1934, he describes a partial skeleton of a massive, if mysterious, theropod that he names Bahariosaurus ingens. The appearance and evolutionary history of this animal remain shrouded in mystery to this day. He also announces his awesomely named Carcharodontosaurus saharicus, the shark-toothed reptile of the Sahara. Numerous teeth, as well as large portions of this dinosaur's hind limbs, pelvis, and skull are preserved, allowing for a thorough description. Also present are numerous remains of fish, including the fossils of an extinct sawfish called Onchopristis. Present too were several wonderful crocs. Stomatosuchus, bigger than any living saltwater crocodile, possessed a skull as flat as a pancake and a lower jaw entirely devoid of teeth. Its life habits remain unclear. Smaller and cuter is Libycosuchus, puppy-sized and agile. This was one of the many prehistoric crocs that would have been more at home on land than in the water. Lovely and strange kinds of turtles, snakes, and marine plesiosaurs also filled the waters of Bahariya. Through a series of richly illustrated, magnificently detailed monographs, Stromer does something that few human beings ever get the chance to do. He gives life to a forgotten corner of planet Earth, a miniature world lost in the swells of time. By age 60, Stromer had become the head of the paleontology department at the prestigious Bavarian State Collection of Paleontology and Historical Geology. A few years later, in 1934, another man is awarded a promotion. A 45-year-old Austrian named Adolf Hitler becomes the chancellor and the face of Germany. And the rest is history. But where does that leave us with Stromer? On the surface, Stromer seemed to fit Hitler's mold perfectly. He's what he would have called a racially pure Aryan, with a Germanic pedigree that stretched back to the Middle Ages. He was a victim of the same socio-economic collapse that left him and the German populace poor and embittered after the Great War. And now, he's faced with an ambitious new leader, promising a path to restore German honor and pride through a tidal wave of nationwide enthusiasm. Still, this 65-year-old despised the Nazi regime. Under the crushing weight of a monstrous social pressure, he stood tall as a steadfast and vocal opponent of Hitler's agenda. Perhaps it was his taste of the First World War, some 20 years earlier, first as a nurse treating the wounded and later as a military geologist, that had left him skeptical of mindless nationalism. But now, under the Reich's racially based Nuremberg laws, his most heinous sin is his refusal to shun Jewish friends and colleagues. If any German could be said to have been in a good position to speak out, it was Stromer. He belonged to a family of aristocrats, upstanding and productive citizens of the city of Nuremberg for 500 years, where his own father had served as mayor. Germans like Stromer were the last people the Nazis wanted to hound, so he savored some protections, at least for a while. Amidst Hitler's soaring popularity, two events must have particularly troubled Stromer. The first occurred on September 1st, 1939, when the German military invaded Poland and the tenuous web of lies and useless political dams that had been staving off World War for years finally crumbled. 30 years earlier, during his third and final expedition to Egypt, Stromer was introduced to the daughter of a colleague, whom he later married in Germany. As another total war, again with Germany at its center, threatened to plunge Europe into chaos, Stromer must have feared deeply for their 3 young sons. The next troublesome event was more local. In 1940, the director of the Bavarian State Natural History Collections, a friend of Stromer's named Ferdinand Bro-Lilly, retired. His replacement was Karl Bjorlin, a young, energetic paleontologist and devout Nazi. It goes without saying that Stromer and Bjorlin were less than chummy. By 1944, at the peak of his savage global war, Hitler had a long list of questionable tactical decisions to answer for. With an Allied land invasion imminent, with Russian hordes mobbing ferociously from the east, thirsting for revenge, and as metal flocks of British and American bombers were delivering payloads of hellish incendiaries over German cities with ruthless regularity, Stromer grew uneasy. Numerous towns, villages, and cities had felt such aerial kisses, and many thousands of civilians were dead. Not even Berlin was safe, as the bombing campaign had, by then, left more than 1.5 million people without homes. At this moment, though, Munich had, so far, been spared. But to many, these other attacks were merely a presage of destruction. It was only a matter of time, it was feared, before the wretched buzz of swarming engines would thunder across Munich's sky. Stromer knew in his core that if the museum collections were to be saved, action had to be taken at once. But when he raised these concerns to Bjorlin, he was chastised for it. To worry about the war effort was, to this Nazi, something only a defeatist could admit. The way Bjorlin saw things, there was no greater cause than that of the Third Reich, and if Germany were to lose the war, the museum collections would be worthless anyway. Amidst rumors that other German institutions were evacuating art and science collections to the safety of basements, salt mines, and even caves, Bjorlin, presiding over the grandest natural history collection in Central Europe, had the final say, and as Stromer's pleadings became increasingly desperate, he only dug his heels in deeper. Twice, Bjorlin warned the old man that he had the power to have him sent to a concentration camp. Stromer wasn't alone in his angst. Some curators took matters into their own hands and managed to sneak much of the museum's zoology collections to safety. Bro-Lilly personally hid a number of smaller fossils in his briefcase and delivered them to the castle of a fossil-loving princess north of the city. But no matter how much he felt for the man, Bro-Lilly could not fit his friend's dinosaurs into a briefcase. Across the English Channel, Munich was a target of growing interest for the Allies.
Okay, don't shout all at once.
On the night of April 24th, 1944, Stromer's fears are realized. His one-of-a-kind collection of Egyptian fossils were smashed to powder. But Stromer was growing numb to such blows. It's been suggested that the decision to place his 2 oldest sons into units that would face some of the most vicious combat was a deliberate form of indirect punishment. Practically the instant they were drafted, his 2 oldest, Ulmen and Wolfgang, were thrown into the grips of a frigid, war-torn Russia to face the Soviets. Ullman, his oldest, was the first to die, killed in combat in 1941. 7 months after the raid on Munich, his middle child, Wolfgang, vanished on the Eastern Front. And exactly 1 year after the bombings, his youngest, 18-year-old Gerard, was killed, fighting the Allies in northern Germany. 2 weeks later, the war in Europe was over. Stromer was the model for what good science is: cautious, self-aware, and precise. He was, as an admirer of his once wrote, a man with a mind that judged without prejudice, inclined to argument almost by principle. It's especially sad to consider the qualities that served him so well as a scientist were ultimately what cost him the most. But there was a break in the clouds. Wolfgang, who'd gone missing in Russia and was feared dead, was back among the living. His physics background was grounds for his Soviet captors to demand that he help concoct chemical weapons for Stalin. When he failed to comply, he was exiled to labor in a series of Siberian gulags. After more than 5 years, a sentence that must have felt like 1,000, he was freed in 1950. Just in time, too, as when Wolfgang came home, his father was now in his 80th year. It was as if Stromer had kept himself alive through sheer willpower. Now satisfied that his son was safe and expecting his first child, Stromer allowed death to greet him at the family castle in Nuremberg in 1952. He was 82 years old. While Stromer was respected in his lifetime, his contributions were largely forgotten after his death. Most classic dinosaur books written over the next few decades make no mention of him, Margraf, or the Bahariya fossils. Citations are the currency of academia. Without a steady stream of them, one's work can quickly fade into the background. Stromer's publications were of little use to those busy working on the different, more accessible dinosaurs spilling out of rocks across western North America and Asia. Spinosaurus the animal vanished from the Earth after perhaps 1 million years of incremental environmental change, but it vanished again after just 3 decades contact with humanity, making it one of the few species to go extinct twice. In the decades following the war, Spinosaurus remained an island in the theropod family tree, a loner without relatives. Occasionally it lived a second life in picture books or dinosaur encyclopedias, invariably pictured as a colossal, sail-backed clone of Allosaurus. But with no tangible remains in existence, it was in a kind of limbo, one step between the mythical realm of the Yeti or the Griffin and the world of observable, concrete zoology. Some would come to question its very existence as an animal, asking if it were not some chimera of multiple skeletons mistakenly confused to be one. But it was real. Finds elsewhere in the Sahara, in Europe, Asia, and South America were waiting to prove it. And they're waiting for us in the next episode. Planning on time traveling, are you? I see you've got the dial set here to 70 million years before the present. That'll be an interesting trip, I can assure you. But I suggest that you keep your distance from the forest edge. You'll find that terrible things lurk there. Gigantic, hungry things that draw slow, hissing gulps of air. If you have the patience, and if you wait at a safe distance, you'll see explosions of teeth and jaws erupt from darkness like shellfire. You'll see fangs sink into the backs and tails of fleeing dinosaurs. You'll see hides opened, muscles torn, and organs devoured. As surreal as it sounds, it is plain fact that for many millions of years on our spinning, terraqueous globe, death by tyrannosaur was quite an ordinary way to go. These days, tyrannosaurs are difficult to find. Hiking through outcrops in Montana or the Dakotas, where ancient mounds project like ruins from the Great Plains, you might walk past parts of 100 triceratops, horns, toes, teeth, without seeing a single one of its enemies. But when you're alone with your thoughts in the swaying prairie, no matter where your mind may wander, it never strays too far from the beast, from the hope of finding one in the wild, a rex in the rough, a tooth or limb crumbling out of some forlorn mound. But there is a place where tyrannosaurs are not the exception, a place where mazes of sandstone bring you face to face with one of nature's grandest inventions. These dinosaurs sleep not in the prairie of Montana cattle ranches, but in the land of Genghis Khan, the vast deserts of Central Asia. While their fossils may have been known to wanderers for thousands of years, inspiring legends of griffins that guard mountains of gold, science only met the dinosaurs of Mongolia in the 1920s, when an American adventurer led an epic series of expeditions into that world of wind and dust. There is no similar area of the inhabited Earth about which so little is known, wrote Roy Chapman Andrews of the American Museum of Natural History. With Andrews at the helm, camel caravans and primitive cars cruised through the blank spaces on the map to find the so-called missing link between humans and apes. It was not yet known that it was Africa, not Asia, from which our curious species emerged. Still, these sojourners returned to their homes as heroes, for they brought back stories, films, and bones from the most surreal graveyards on Earth. They found outstanding quantities of pristine dinosaur skeletons, all of them never before seen species. They found oblong stones with strange textures, and in a moment that may have bordered on the transcendent, realized that they were cradling the first dinosaur eggs ever identified. All the while, fed up with centuries of Chinese oppression, Mongolia began warming up to Russian influence. During the 1930 expedition, the Americans saw the husks of torched villages filled with bodies, and heard that even one of Andrews' friends had been assassinated. Mongolia had become an exceedingly good place to leave, said Andrews. From then on, outsiders would be treated with the utmost suspicion, and the treasure fields of the Gobi Desert became inaccessible. In 1941, a message arrived at the Russian Academy of Sciences. The Mongolian government wanted Soviet scientists to make some explorations of their own, but these preparations were thwarted by a small After the war, a leader was selected in the stout Ivan Efremov, known to some as a paleontologist and to countless more as a best-selling science fiction writer. And there's perhaps no better fodder for science fiction than the land to which they were headed. The Gobi's endless vistas whistled with the wind of a dead planet. Dust storms screamed with Martian vigor. Mongolia was 2.5 times the size of France, but fewer than 1 million people lived beneath its wide skies. To some especially remote, yurt-dwelling nomads, the herd of trucks appeared like terrifying and mysterious beasts in the haze. They made it farther than Andrews ever could, and found what paleontologist Mike Novacek described as the broiling, isolated depression known as the Nemegt Valley. By the time they had finished with it, it would be known to the locals and to the world as the Valley of the Dragons. The Nemegt sediments, it was found, preserved remains of a vast river delta where streams carved channels through forest and plain, inviting gigantic 10-ton herbivores. By the end of their third expedition in 1949, Efremov's teams had filled 460 crates with 120 tons of bones. Their bounty was loaded into rail cars on the Trans-Siberian Railway, bound for Moscow. 20 years before, Andrews' team had introduced to the world the lithe velociraptor and the hollow, otherworldly skeleton of the oviraptor, leaving Western scientists to wonder what else was hiding in those forbidden seas of sand. From Ulaanbaatar, the payload crossed through almost 4,000 miles of icy forests and lonely mountains, the furthest any of the extinct passengers had traveled in 70 million years. In 1955, dinosaur expert Evgeny Malayev published a report called Giant Carnivorous Dinosaurs of Mongolia. While few experts outside of Russia could read the Cyrillic report, the drawings were worth 1,000,000 words. Here was a huge skull, 4 foot long according to the scale bar, and a spitting image of Tyrannosaurus rex. Their similarity was enough to summon a phantom bridge from the depths of the sea. That lost link between the old world and new was trod by dinosaurs long before the peopling of the Americas began in the forgotten ice fields of history. The huge skull offered a chilling confirmation that both continents were play pits for one of the most feared silhouettes in history. For countless animals unfortunate enough to be born into the same slice of space and time, in Asia or North America, their final vision in life was that sardonic, fang-filled grin. Malayev did not consider his fossil to be Tyrannosaurus rex proper. He placed it in the genus Tyrannosaurus, but gave it a distinct second, or species name, calling it Tyrannosaurus batar, batar being the misspelled Mongolian word for hero. Tyrannosaurus batar. Doesn't quite roll off the tongue in the same way. To me at least, it seems strange to hear anything other than Rex come after Tyrannosaurus. A bit like hearing Genghis Changhatai, the Mongolian word for baby, instead of Genghis Khan. At this time, there were only a few decent T-Rex specimens in existence, all of them found in the western US, one housed in Pittsburgh and one in Manhattan, where the only complete skull lived at the American Museum of Natural History. But by the 1950s, all of a sudden the Russian Academy of Sciences, which previously had almost no dinosaur collection to speak of, boasted an incredible amount of material, including several well-preserved tyrannosaurs with a series of beautiful skulls. It had taken half a century prior to come up with the planet's supply of tyrannosaurids, including T-Rex, Gorgosaurus, and Albertosaurus from the US and Canada. The Soviets matched this in just a few seasons. Malayev was a bit trigger-happy though. Out of this tyrannosaur collection, he saw 4 species, where now we just see 1. Because the skulls varied greatly in size and slightly in shape, he assumed that each size class was a species all of its own. One of his colleagues corrected this mistake, pointing out that the differences were all to do with age, the smallest skull being the youngest, the largest the oldest, an interpretation that Malayev eventually accepted. Some now consider the Mongolian Tyrannosaur different enough from T-Rex to deserve the distinct first name Tarbosaurus, which translates to alarming reptile. We'll refer to it as Tarbosaurus batar, or T. batar for simplicity's sake. Tarbosaurus was Malayev's darling. He studied it incessantly for years, even made casts of the cavities in the skull so as to examine its brain shape, writing that the plaster mold of Tarbosaurus' cranial cavity is morphologically hardly distinguishable from that of Tyrannosaurus rex. As a kid, I saw drawings of Tarbosaur skulls in my dinosaur books, drawings that I now recognize to be figures taken from Malayev's papers, and I remember straining to visually discern the difference between it and T-Rex. After working through the original literature, I found that even for the experts, the differences between them are somewhat trifling. To the casual observer, the most obvious is in their size. While the largest Tarbosaurs, like Malayev's huge 4-foot skull, approach the size of some T-Rex specimens, they tend to be less massive. The lengthiest T-Rex known are about 42 feet long or so, and estimated to weigh about 8.4 metric tons, or 18,500 pounds, while Tarbosaurus is closer to 30 or so feet, and 5 metric tons, or 11,000 pounds, a much leaner build. The remaining anatomical distinctions between them are very real, but very esoteric. Suffice it to say that T. batar's teeth are thinner and smaller relative to T-Rex, that its snout is narrower, skull lighter, and that the roughened, horn-like knobs above the eyes were not as well developed. And those tiny arms for which T-Rex is famous are, in Tarbosaurus, tinier still. Overall, they're more alike than different, and would have seemed like doppelgangers. Had Malayev's big Tarbosaur skull been found in Montana or South Dakota, few would have suspected it to be anything but a T-Rex. Paleontologist Greg Paul once went as far as to write that Tarbosaurus may have been a, quote, interbreeding geographical subspecies of T-Rex, much as the Eurasian brown bear and American grizzly are subspecies of Ursus arctos. Of course, we may never know if the two were interfertile, but the fact that they occur on different continents means that they were effectively reproductively isolated. Their habitat supported different prey species too, another selection factor. Asia was home to long-necked titanosaurs like Nemegtosaurus, bizarre and gigantic feathered Therizinosaurus and Dinosaurs. Conversely, titanosaurs were much rarer in most of T-Rex's range, and there didn't seem to be any of those pot-bellied monstrosities from the Nemegt. In their place were huge populations of dangerous, well-defended Triceratops, while in Asia, large horned ceratopsians were either non-existent or extremely rare. Tyrannosaurus and Tarbosaurus lived among and hunted duck-billed dinosaurs like Edmontosaurus or Saurolophus, and both had to contend with grumpy, armor-plated ankylosaurs. It's uncertain if or exactly how long the two species overlapped in time. We know that T-Rex lived from about 68 to 66 million years ago, right up until the final extinction of the dinosaurs. But the precise age of the Nemegt formation is unknown because no well-defined ash layers, which provide the data for acquiring precise ages, have been identified. By correlating the fossils found within the Nemegt to those of other formations for which solid dates are known, geologists have suggested that the world of Tarbosaurus is, as stated, about 70 million years old. A series of hugely successful Polish expeditions in the 60s and 70s under the direction of Zofia Jaworowska procured several remarkable tarbosaurs. Perhaps a bit jealous of their success, another wave of Russian scientists made collections from the Gobi in the 70s. By 1990, the deterioration of the Soviet Union had opened the country up to explorers from the West. Many tarbosaurs have been found since, including this picturesque skeleton of a 3-year-old juvenile. Traces of live tarbosaurs are known too. While one of the toes in this cast appears to have eroded away, the intact toes are tipped by impressions of its big claws, and miraculously, a pebbly texture behind the toes is what remains of its fossil skin. In fact, several tarbosaurs have been found with some impressions of soft tissue. One specimen, sadly ravaged by fossil poachers, preserved little patches of skin, probably from the torso. One expert records that paleontologist Konstantin Mikhailov saw, quote, impressions of skin around a badly weathered skull of Tyrannosaurus batar that showed the presence of a wattle or bag of skin under the jaws, unquote. There is a certain segment of humanity, myself among them, that have been waiting at the edge of their chair for many years in hopes of hearing the headline, "Big carnivorous dinosaur mummy found, skin of face preserved." Unfortunately, probably due to its poor state of preservation, the skull with the skin from the jaws was not collected, and no photographs of it seem to exist. Still we sit, hoping that one day the odds of erosion and decay will have been beaten at least once. When dinosaur skeletons began to be strung up in the Soviet Union, Russian artists, who have remained in relative obscurity, stepped in to animate them. Among the greats was Konstantin Konstantinovich Flyorov. If he disliked someone, a colleague once wrote of him, he would disregard all acceptable behavior. He was as vindictive as an elephant, and in the heat of the moment he was as invincible as a bison during the rut. Flyorov was not tyrannized by his own scientific background. He avoided scientific literalism, wrote a colleague. Something else was more important for him. These were not lifelike renditions of prehistoric animals, but fever dreams, splendid deliriums, populated by dinosaurs. His landscapes swirl and pulse on the canvas like someone had given Van Gogh a time machine. When they're set at dusk, his primordial skies burn with dust. Set at night, and they shine with a ghostly luminescence. A 1955 painting, produced when Malayev first published a description of Tarbosaurus, may be the first depiction of the animal. Following Flyorov's death, the State Orlov Museum in Moscow commissioned a pair of artists to create a 28-meter-long fresco, which they named Late Cretaceous Landscape of the South Gobi, completed in 1986. It depicts the haze of a sunset universe, where unfamiliar reptiles preside over swamp and jungle. On the far left, a spindle-armed tarbosaur peels from the trees to stalk the lumbering bathers. Over 1,000 chicken yolks were sacrificed to produce this celestial dream. It was a post-nuclear world, the tensest decades in history. But on both sides of the Iron Curtain, artists reveled in the mystery of vanished worlds, and children craned their necks upward with wonder and delight at towering skeletons and magnificent murals of lost worlds. If you see a sandy brown bone of a velociraptor, Saurolophus, or Tarbosaurus for sale, you're looking at a smuggled object. Fossil poaching in the Gobi has been disastrous for science. Expert Phil Curry claims to have found almost 100 poached skeletons of Tarbosaurus alone in the field since 2000. What would have been a promising quarry is reduced to fossil rubble. Bones are ripped from the ground without care, jaws hammered apart to extract lucrative teeth. So when a 24-foot skeleton of a subadult tarbosaur was lined up for auction in New York City in 2012, paleontologists worked to salvage it from disappearing into a private collection. Mongolian paleontologist Bolor Minjin, longtime U.S. resident, overheard a news report about the auction.
It's hard to imagine anything larger than this beast over here, because look at the skull alone. The skull alone is about,
She wrote to Heritage Auctions that, quote, "The auctioning of such specimens fuels the illegal fossil trade and must be stopped." Word began to spread in the scientific community, and a petition to prevent the sale gathered thousands of signatures. Minjin's letter was answered by Heritage Auctions' attorney, who wrote that no impropriety exists, and with a line that made paleontologists don a collective cringe, went on to say that, quote, "Mongolia won its independence in 1921, and this specimen is quite a bit older than that." The sale went through for $1,052,500. But when Homeland Security appeared, the company changed its tune.
Well, good morning, and Sein Bainu, as they say in Mongolian. I am John Morton, the Director of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Today we do something extraordinary. We return to the people of Mongolia a 70-million-year-old dinosaur that was looted from the rocky sands of the Gobi Desert.
The Tyrannosaur was seized by the U.S. government, as was a Tarbosaur skull that actor Nicolas Cage had bought from the same dealer. The Tarbosaur was repatriated to Mongolia and then mounted for display. Within a year, it had been seen by 750,000 Mongolians. The people of Mongolia could rightfully see the lifeless bones of their reptilian hero, but the children and dreamers among them saw more than bone. They caught mental glimpses of the world it lived in, the turtles and crocodiles ambling through the mud, the rivers gushing over soggy banks, and those dark forests where immense shadow beings stare with an ancient patience to which only the harvesters of living flesh abide, where saliva drips at the clueless approach of a naive herbivore.